All right, hey everybody. This is an external design system in practice. Hopefully you're in the right place. If not, we can just take the chairs that we put out and put them back. But I am Brian Perry. I'm a lead front-end developer at Bounteous. I live in the Chicago suburbs, which is more relevant to say when you are speaking at other camps. Substantially less interesting here. I'm a lover of all things component and component-driven, so building with components in Drupal, design systems, tools like Pattern Lab, and increasingly building with component-based frameworks, JavaScript frameworks like React. And I also love all things Nintendo, little Mario on my shoulder there. So happy to talk about the cool games that you're playing on your Nintendo Switch. I am playing Hollow Knight and Tetris 99. Turns out Tetris is awesome again, so that's cool. I also love learning lately about the Jamstack and static sites and kind of alternative approaches to the traditional LAMP stack that we're used to. I'll be talking about that tomorrow morning if you want to hear me talk about more things. And if you don't, I get it. So I work at a company called Bounteous, as I mentioned. And we have a great Drupal practice. I work with a bunch of super smart folks, learn a ton of things from everybody. Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do. That will come up later. But we also are hiring. I think we have an open architect role, so I would love to work with you as well. And so you may not know Bounteous. You may not know me as someone who works at a company called Bounteous. And that is because we recently rebranded. We used to be HS2 Solutions. This was my company intro slide back then. And that's actually kind of going to drive some of the discussion in this talk. So we're going to talk about a rebranding story that kind of leads to the concept of using a external design system and kind of keeping it outside of Drupal. So I worked on our project to rebuild our website as part of the rebrand. So we were going from HS2 Solutions to Bounteous, two different looking websites. And we were aiming for November 5th, 2018 for the brand launch. And the website, although day-to-day it didn't necessarily feel like this to me, but the website was one small part in a larger coordinated effort. There were other things that had to happen on November 5th. Press releases, new email addresses, business cards, company swag, all that stuff. And then as part of this process, we were migrating a few sites into a new Drupal 8 build. So the HS2 solution site was on Drupal 7. And then part of the rebrand, we had acquired a few companies. We were also migrating their data into this Drupal 8 site. So there's the LUNAMETRICS site, which is on WordPress, and then also Infield Digital, which is also on WordPress. So Nate kind of took the lead on the migrations. So it was mostly the blog content that was being migrated in because we were rebranding. Some of the other content and other components were kind of being built from scratch in the new Drupal 8 site, but mostly the blog content coming over. So while that's going on, at the same time, I was working with the XD team, specifically Leon was leading the charge here, and he was doing wireframes in Sketch and sharing them in InVision. And I was doing my best to follow along at the same time in Pattern Lab to get some of those prototypes in code so we could see them in browser, experiment at different breakpoints, and just kind of follow along, play along, hopefully influence the wireframing in a way that was helpful. So I was doing that in Pattern Lab. And then that process kind of continued, so we moved on to, from the wireframes to some higher fidelity mocks, adding more of the look and feel there. So I was taking those prototypes and, again, just trying to come along and play along at the same time. So we reached the point here where we have some data migrated into the new Drupal 8 site. We have this separate repository with these Pattern Lab prototypes and twig templates and compiled CSS and JavaScript. So now the question comes: how are we going to make use of this in Drupal, or as I put it here, cryptically, deciding where to put the mustard? Because I have a ridiculous metaphor to explain this. So it's the concept of mustard ANAs, and if you know what that reference is, I give you a big thumbs up. It's a sketch comedy deep cut. Versus having mustard and mayonnaise as things that are separate instead of intertwined in one single jar. So what I had actually done typically in the past, taking a component-based approach to Drupal theming, is to embed Pattern Lab as a tool kind of inside of our theme. And then also a number of the component-based or Pattern Lab-based contrib themes out there do the same thing. I think it was kind of a common approach in general. It has some pluses. So it's probably easier for you to get at the components in Drupal if it's just all in the theme where you expect things to be. Potentially simplifies the build process on the Drupal side in some ways. And for people who are used to just looking in their Drupal theme and finding the files there, it might be easier for them to wrap their heads around. One of the potential disadvantages to this approach is it's prone to Drupal-specific things making their way into the components that either, if you're using Pattern Lab has to account for, but also it starts to make these components things that aren't reusable and aren't like CMS agnostic. So depending on your project, that may be a bad thing. It may not. Versus kind of where we're at this particular point in the project. We had Drupal stuff, mostly migrations going on, prototyping in a completely separate repository using Pattern Lab as a tool. So we had separate Drupal repository, separate design system repository. Theoretically, we have this design system, something that could be used beyond just use in Drupal. It could be used in different contexts. But the question that you kind of had to figure out here is, where do we want to put the mustard? So decided to keep the mustard separate in this case, not going with Heinz Mayo Must, which is actually a real thing that they're going to start selling if you didn't hear that recently. I'm sure it tastes great. So I think this has a better shot at keeping the components kind of CMS or Drupal agnostic. I think it does, it kind of depends on your workflow and approach, but I think it might encourage prototyping, so it's not entwined into Drupal, and I think if it's embedded in the theme, it's more likely that people are going to hack things together and see it in Drupal, rather than taking advantage of these Pattern Lab prototypes that can be mixed and matched and played around with. And it also already was a separate project, so it's potentially the don't change what you're doing approach. And then there were some gut feelings that went into it. It's always kind of conceptually felt like the right way to approach this, even if it hasn't been what I've done. It's advocated by a bunch of folks in the community who I trust as a general approach. And also, there's the idea that it might be something that we could use for other web-related projects related to our brand. And also, for us, it felt right for us as a company because we have a lot of employees with a diverse set of skills. These aren't all front-end developers, and in fact, I'm sure at this point some of these people don't even work here anymore. But we do have a lot of people who can write great CSS, JavaScript, and HTML, but may not be Drupal folks. And in theory, this would allow more people from throughout the company to contribute to the design system and contribute to our site in some interesting ways. So now that we've decided we're going to keep the design system separate, how exactly are we going to go about that to get it available in Drupal? So in the design system repository, we need a composer.json file with just a little bit of information in it. So we need to give the project a name, so we can require it as a dependency, give it a description. And then we also specify a type of design system here. We'll see how that's used in a second. And then in the Drupal project, here's how we're pulling in this repository as a dependency. So in the repository section in composer.json, we have to let it know about the Git repository where the design system project lives. So right next to the packages.drupal.org, just slightly less important, but right next to it in the repository section. And then under extra here, we define an installer type of design system. And in the design system, we said that it was of type design system. So when we pull that in, we're just specifying what's going to happen with the dependency, where we're going to put it. So we're saying that the design system goes in the theme in a directory called libraries. Went a little bit back and forth as to exactly where that should live and how it should be handled. But the idea there is hopefully that's indicating that this is like a dependency that you're not supposed to be touching. Did look at just having it in like the vendor directory. There are some issues, at least from my experience, of trying to reach in the theme into kind of deep vendor directories. And I also wanted this to be a dependency not of the theme, but of the project itself. So those were some of the complications there. But once you do that, you can require that project as a dependency. So we can say composer require and give our really readable short name here. And we require the design system at dev for most of the pre-launch cycle. And then when we want to pull in updates, we just run composer update. So on the Drupal side here, we have control of when we actually want to pull in the latest features and components from the design system. We also tag major releases in the design system. We did still most of the time kind of just point at like the head for the project, but there were situations where we did require a specific tag. It was also helpful a few times to be able to roll back to a particular tag in the design system. So nice that that was possible to do. So we have it now as a dependency. Here are a couple things that we did just to take advantage of those assets in the theme. So in our libraries.yaml file, we had a global library that pointed to the compiled CSS file and a couple of the JavaScript bundles. So that just makes that stuff available. And then in the info.yaml file, using the components module, we defined a few twig namespaces. So there's the images namespace was really just a shortcut for some assets that we're using throughout the theme. And then the others are kind of just like the main sections of the kind of atomic folders in the Pattern Lab design system. We're not actually using the typical atomic design naming, but it's kind of in the neighborhood. So at that point, we can, well, those templates are available to Drupal. We can reference them in other templates, all of that good stuff. So moving on to a little bit more of the build as well. This is kind of a workflow that the team fell into that I thought was useful and interesting. So we've got Sean here, and Sean can certainly Drupal, but I think what Sean does really well is just write really good HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that may not be particular to a certain CMS. He can really bang that stuff out. So he worked in the design system, primarily building out all of the additional components that we needed for launch. He only ended up having 2 commits in the Drupal project for the whole time that he worked on it. But without him, we would not have had a theme. And then Wade was kind of the glue man in the middle, who was wiring Drupal into those components and integrating things, building some things on the back end, mapping into those components. So most of his effort was in the Drupal repository, but there would be cases where he would make adjustments in the design system, either perhaps it's something that wasn't really accounted for when the component was built in isolation, or admittedly just things to make his life or the life of Drupal just a little easier in some cases. But that general kind of split seemed to work pretty well, and I think a lot of people to be efficient and work on some of the stuff that they are great at working on. So, as the project goes on, there were some interesting changes in scope that I think the fact that we happen to have an external design system allowed us to make some interesting choices that helped us in the build. I wish it was, really wasn't much more of a gut feeling that got us to this point in some ways, but in hindsight, it really helped a lot. So the LUNAMETRICS site, they offered a number of trainings, and Bounteous still does now. We actually had a Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager training yesterday. But they have a training section on their website where they list all the upcoming trainings, and you can register and sign up for the trainings. And we reached the point where the training portion of the site wasn't going to be able to be in our scope with the timeline that we had. there was also some kind of new functionality integrations that were part of the training section that we just weren't going to be able to rebuild in Drupal in the time that we needed to do it. So we needed to, we came to the conclusion that we could let the training section of the existing WordPress site live on, but it was going to have to match the look and feel of the rest of the Drupal 8 site. And we were actually really well suited to do that because we have this external design system. I don't know that we would have even actually been able to do this without it, or it would have been a lot less fun, I think. So for that, we worked with Walia Creative. They had done the theming of the original WordPress site and were available to handle this reskin, and we needed some extra hands. And so they had that familiarity. They also introduced us to the Timber plugin, which is something that I had never heard of before, which is pretty awesome. And it allows you to use Twig in WordPress. I really like their slogan there, that because WordPress is awesome, but the loop isn't. So for the initial kind of prototypes they put together to show that it would be feasible to have the WordPress training section look like the rest of our Drupal 8 site, they used Timber pretty extensively. So they were actually using the Twig templates from the design system and passing data, in some cases kind of static, into it in the initial prototype. But I think it allowed them to move pretty fast with that initial phase there. So this is just an example of what that looks like. So here on the training page, we have a listing of upcoming trainings, and each row is like a training item component. So in this training module.php file here, there's a wrapping div and then a for loop that goes through the data available to the template and assembles a training element. And it's essentially just an array of all the data that we want available to that row. If you look at it, it's really not all that different from the sort of mappings that we would do to pass data into a Twig template in Drupal or a render array or something like that. And then in the training element.php template here, it has all the data that we assembled available to it, and we can actually just say Timber render, provide the Twig template that we want to render that data using, and pass the data into it. So at the end result, we get that training section using those components. So we were able to take the old LUNAMETRICS site, reskin it to match the Bounteous look and feel, include it in the main nav, and have our secret WordPress section. We did, kind of leading up to the launch, I think take a little less advantage of the Timber functionality to kind of take a bit of a more traditional approach to get it across the finish line. That'll come up a little bit later. And then very close to launch, we had another company join the Bounteous family, real close to launch. So that certainly did affect what we were and were not able to do here. But so they were going to, DMAC Media was going to be rebranded as Bounteous.ca. And it was going to be a smaller scale site, acknowledging that there was going to be some difference in the look and feel, partially because of the timeline. It resulted in a more manual and more selective use of the things in the design system, but it definitely made the conversation a lot easier when some of our teams got together to talk about what we were going to do here. I was able to say, we have this design system project. It's up on Bitbucket here. We can give you access to it, explain a little bit about what's there, what tools are there. And basically at that point, they had the opportunity to use it however they see fit. As I mentioned, they kind of pulled specific assets and certain classes from it. But it's certainly better than them not having anything and just like going and scraping our website or looking at our Drupal repository or something. So I think that helped there too. So post-launch, so we made November 5th, I believe the date was, and we had our relaunch site with the new brand, pulling in data from the other sites, our training site living on, which was super exciting. But, so we continue updates to the site and post-launch fixes and things like that. I rolled off as far as day-to-day and moving on to some other projects, and other folks rolled on. Kyle and Steve have been doing some work. And now at this point, the majority of the fixes and tickets that they're working with are kind of specific to Drupal. And also probably the external design system approach and some of this workflow was kind of new to them. So paraphrasing here, but I feel like they kind of got a little bit of the feeling like, why can't I just Drupal? What's with the having to make changes in the external design system and things like that? So certainly learned some lessons in the experience of onboarding some people to this after the fact. It really stressed how important the documentation is for something like this. You know, I did my best to try to have details in the README, have a lot of NPM scripts that are going to help with the general workflow and build process, stuff on Confluence. But I think that what would have been helpful is actually more information on not just how things are done, but like why we're taking this approach and why it's useful for this project and the ways that it might be helping us. And then also, this was actually something that I was able to get in place before we rolled new people onto the project, but it became apparent that we needed to improve the process for people being able to experiment within Drupal. So it's pretty cumbersome to have to go, to make like a small little fix in Drupal and see it on its feet, to have to go into the design system, make a commit there, pull things in via Composer, see that it wasn't what you wanted. So we added some gulp tasks that basically allow you to clone the repository alongside the Drupal project, make changes and experiment, copy it over to Drupal, see what the changes are, and know that that's exactly what you want to commit to the design system. So it basically just made it easier to experiment in both places. You want to prototype in the design system, great, that's what it's suited for. And if you want to do some more experimentation for quick fixes in Drupal, that's a little bit easier too. So that was pretty important. But also, when the day-to-day of your work is in a particular CMS, I do want to acknowledge that there is some overhead here. So I think it helped us in the lead up to launch, but some overhead after the fact. Okay. And then, so mentioned the fact that we also did not take advantage of the Timber approach exclusively on the WordPress site. So we definitely ran into things, and I think this is, in a weird way, I was kind of happy to hear this. But we made visual fixes on the Drupal site to like the hover for the training component or something. And the expectation is that a change in Drupal to a component that has a related piece on the WordPress site is just going to work. So I think that we're working on kind of layering in that more, but it really wasn't apparent to me basically how much worth the effort it would be to have that one consistent thing. Because I think this is people's expectation, and explaining to people that, oh, actually that's the WordPress portion of the site. It's just not what people expect. So we're trying to layer some of that stuff back on after the fact. So, kind of wrapping up here, but so the kind of question that you might be left with hearing about some of this, and even me for future projects, is if an external design system would be right, and where you should put the mustard in your particular case. And it's tough. It's kind of going to be something that is a case-by-case or project-by-project basis. I read on the Lullabot blog, and they had a great podcast episode about it, about their rebuild of lullabot.com. And very interesting in general, and it's not directly related to the concept of having an external design system, but they were very intentionally trying to focus with their rebuild on trying to keep things kind of traditional Drupal and use as much of core as possible, and really take advantage of the fact that they have a bunch of Drupal experts. So that's a case where the overhead for keeping this external might not be worth it, especially if they don't have ways that they know they're going to reuse those components for other things related to the Lullabot brand. But So things that you might consider when thinking about this is if there really is going to be value in being able to reuse those components. And even from my experience on this project, it's hard to know for sure. I didn't really know until we were part of the way through the build and some of the scope changed that this was actually going to be a huge advantage. And then also, I mean, something that I always go back to, and I always want to see as much prototyping and code done as possible, but the role that prototypes play in the project might influence your decision there. Is prototyping and code important? Do you want to publish your design system independently? Maybe that's another reason that it should live separately. And then other questions are just going to be team composition. Like, how is this workflow going to fit into your team's workflow? Is it something that kind of works with people's skill sets? And then the general makeup as well. Is it going to allow more people to contribute or not? So again, I don't think there's a simple, easy answer here, but something that you kind of have to think of on a case-by-case basis. But again, considering that this site is something that I'd like to be able to see more people outside of just our Drupal folks to be able to pitch in on. I'm hoping it has some advantages to come. And again, I think it really helped us in the lead up to launch in some ways that I just was not going to be able to predict. So that's that. A couple of other things. There's a contribution day on Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And Amy June's going to be doing a training. I'm going to be helping triage some issues related to the new admin theme that folks are working on. So I'd love to collaborate with people who are going to be around on Saturday and drink lots of coffee with you. Additionally, there is a feedback form on the session node, also a link to the slides if you want to check them out outside of this. But I'd love to hear everybody's feedback. This is my first time giving this talk. Hope to give it again. So it'd be awesome to hear your thoughts. And then thanks and questions. Like 2.5 minutes worth of questions. Yes?
So the design system that you have is published independently. Is it more like Pattern Lab, where it's a little bit more developer focused, or is it more like Brad Frost's style guide kind of situation where it's more marketing and editorial focused?
It is more like, the question was if it was if the external design system was more like Pattern Lab, more of a developer tool, or more like Brad Frost's style guide, which is more of a potentially a marketing tool and kind of more broad documentation. More Pattern Lab. I did actually work on trying to integrate the style guide project as well, and just kind of ran out of time there. I am definitely a big believer in that concept of there being able to be a place for developers to experiment and a place for like clean, clear component documentation. But a lot of stuff going on. Yes?
Seems like this would be useful even if you were just doing like a headless Drupal or progressive web app.
Yep.
Even if you didn't have WordPress to build.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree with that. So the comment was, it seems like it would be useful if you're doing a headless build. Yeah, I agree. It kind of depends a little bit on the different frameworks you're using and things like that. But one thing that I'm considering on a current project that has a React component to it, I've been looking at, through a few people's prodding, I think it's CSS modules, which is a CSS and JS option, but that I think would actually work pretty well with a design system like this, where you could have individual component CSS files that you could pull into the JavaScript components. That was a weird, twisty, long-winded way to agree with you, I guess. Yes?
So you mentioned that one of the pros of having them integrated is that, or I guess is that, let me rephrase, you said it's Drupal agnostic, or it's CMS agnostic to have it separate. And so in my experience, there's always been a case of getting the Pattern Lab templates to work in Drupal required some special stuff to make it work.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering, with keeping it agnostic, how then did you make that work in Drupal? Did you have to modify the templates in the Drupal themes there, or did you just kind of avoid those pitfalls as much as you could?
Yeah, and also probably because we're wrapping up in time, is something we can follow up with later, because that's probably a larger discussion. But the question was really about how we integrated the Drupal data into the components and how we did that successfully. Yeah, I mean, there could actually probably be a separate talk about that particular question, but along the way, I think we learned some ways that we could build our components that were not like Drupal-y in a way, but a little bit easier to integrate into. So some lessons learned there, but I think that there were some tricks that we learned about how we could, like a simple example, and this is something that I've given as examples in previous talks, but like something like an image, rather than having individual slots for the image path and the alt text and those things, if we use like a higher level variable, just like an image variable, we can just let Drupal do what it does well and spit that out in there. And that's a situation where Drupal or WordPress, they can just give an image and we don't have to be as worried about the individual pieces and parts of the CMSs and how they pass into that. But yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. Yes?
Quick question.
Yeah.
So now that it's sort of like decoupled from Drupal, what about taking that another step forward and decoupling the different components within the system? Sort of like what Bolt does right now, where you can include just the elements that you need to keep your CSS and JavaScript load down.
Yep. Yeah, so that question / comment was about doing something like the Bolt system or other design systems where you can require individual components. Yeah, I also think that is a interesting and cool idea and just one we weren't able to tackle. Yeah, we're up on time. Happy to talk more after this or throughout. Thanks.